Now, in the context of in your book, you also explain circumstances in which new laws were created through regulatory bodies and judicial decisions, and sort of a back and forth that led to sort of new ways of legislating that avoided the legislature altogether. So, those two concepts taken together, did forced desegregation end? Was there like a ruling on that stopped that, or did it just peter out? And I ask this because I'm thinking of remedies, right? Like, if that was a negative outcome, was it remedied? How was it remedied? And does it provide a roadmap for future remedy?
No, these things, and that actually is a problem of more general application. Because these laws are not passed in legislatures, they can't really be overturned through legislatures, and it's not really clear how they do get overturned. So you have you wind up with laws that become pretty much eternal. I think a good example is busing is one of them. There are still desegregation plans, I think, in most of the places that got them in the 1970s. I know that Boston, which had the most explosive problem with busing in the 1970s, still maintains a lot of these racial integration programs. But to take the example of say, bilingual education. I was struck by this as I was writing my book. So bilingual education arose in exactly the way you describe. No one ever voted on it. We have bilingual education all over the country by federal decree, but there has never been a vote in Congress about bilingual education. What happened is you had a Supreme Court decision in 1974 called the Lao Decision. And once the Lao Decision was handed down, which stated that people have a right to be instructed in their own language in school if it's holding them back their inability to speak English, it never went to a law. You just had the Department of Education writing these rules, and they were called either the Lao rules or the Lao guidelines. Once they wrote these rules, then the courts took these as law, even though they weren't law. They were just guidelines that some guy had written at his desk some afternoon, and the court started ordering more things, saying like, well, your school district is not obeying the Lao guidelines. And so you wind up having an escalation. Now, bilingual education became really unpopular. I think that it was really discredited by a lot of social science research about educational outcomes, which is why it became unpopular. But actually, it never went away. And in fact, when Michael Bloomberg in New York tried to eliminate bilingual education once and for all, he found it was against the law for him to eliminate it. He couldn't do it. And so New York still has it. It's a striking thing.
I'm reminded of Title IX in this context, in the sense that Title IX, especially the Dear Colleague letters of 2011 and the Obama administration's efforts to end all harassment of all kinds, basically, they issued, like I said, the Dear Colleague letter and new guidelines and regulations that universities who receive federal funding had to adhere to. And in the process, they actually superseded our constitutional rights to due process in many ways. And so is the Title IX experience, the campus sort of rape culture, lashback, is that in the context of this same conversation?
Yes,
here?
that's just what that's exactly what I'm talking about. And actually, it's been pointed out to me that controversy over the Dear Colleague letter actually belonged in the book. I don't cover it in the book. I had a lot of stuff to cover in the Obama administration, but I agree with you that that's a pivotal moment.
Yeah, and it's very important for us and for my audience to understand sort of how that came to be, because the Title IX circumstances and the lack of due process and the believe all women and all of these things, this is something that people in my crowd, we feel very viscerally, right? It's something that affects our lives on a daily basis. You kind of wonder where the power for it came from. And it was one of the things that we certainly, in my mind, in my book, I wrote that I voted for Donald Trump to address that particular issue. And they certainly did make some efforts to do that. Biden administration looking to roll these things back as well. But this is a good example of how the Civil Rights Act has led us to these circumstances in which we feel as though we're being drawn into these conflicts unwillingly. And in your book, you really lay out the argument for how the Civil Rights Act, and in some ways the Immigration Act of 1965 as well, and 86, that these have created a structural polarization in America. Could you address that? Because we're all feeling that right now, that we've been drawn into, especially from my perspective, drawn into a conflict I didn't want anything to do with, that
Right.
now I'm forced to talk about issues I don't want to talk about. I'm talking about race. I don't want to talk about race. I'm Gen X.
Yeah.
You
I
know,
know.
so could you help us understand this environment, because this is truly bedrock understanding of our current circumstances.
I quite agree. And I think those two things you mentioned, the 1965 Immigration Act, and the general sense of being drawn into race where you don't want to be, I think they're actually those are two different things. I think that the 1965 Immigration Act really changed the country a lot sociologically. And it was built on a kind of a fallacy, I suppose, that just because you want to treat people equally because of race in your country, you don't have the right to treat people differently depending on whether they are in your country or outside of it. I think that's a kind of a fallacy. But I think that what you're talking about is it's a kind of creep in the mission of civil rights. And I'm a little older than Gen X, but I remember when I was growing up, and we talked about these things. The liberal view of why civil rights was necessary is that what a terrible burden it is for our country. What a waste of time it is to be talking about what color people are. I mean, it's sort of the kind of thing that you do instead of having relationships with people, instead of forming bonds with people. You start counting what color people are, and that actually is what they did in the South. And it's what people would. The first thing people would say about essentially what's wrong with it. Now, okay, so that's a view we no longer have. How did it change? Okay. This process that I described, through which, a law that was sold to the American people as a way of fixing the race problem in the South, got extended to other groups. So you had, at first, this was a law to help Black people in the South. Then it became a law to help Black people nationwide. Then it became a law to help Black people and immigrants. And then it became a law to help Black people and Spanish speakers. And pretty soon, you had a kind of an interesting dynamic going on among the beneficiaries of this law, because it was no longer just a group that made up 12 or 13% of the population. When you put together Blacks, Hispanics, women, you were starting to get into a pretty serious electoral coalition. And in fact, when you started adding gays and the disabled, you were starting to creep up into, 40%, just women alone gives you the access to a majority. You know what I mean? So you got this term that grew up. It's the most interesting of all these terms that started to grow up in the 1980s, which is people of color. This expression, people of color, sounds like it doesn't mean anything. It sounds kind of like actually a little bit like the, racial epithets people used to use in the 1960s, okay? But when you start calling people of color and say we should be doing more of people of color, well, that actually everyone has a color, except for the people who don't have a color, which are white people. So in the course of just in casual talk, you suddenly created a white group, a white ethnic group, as a kind of a photographic negative of all the people who were supposed to be helped by the civil rights laws. So you suddenly had this group who you called white, who were distinguished by what? Well, they weren't distinguished by anything in particular, except that they were not eligible to use this new powerful constitution. Now, it's a pretty normal political grievance if you belong to a group. If there are two constitutions in a country and your group is the only group not allowed to use the more powerful of the two, it's natural to feel angry about that. But we have so many taboos and things like that. I mean, one would not want people to grow hateful over this, okay? But in fact, the taboos have grown to the point where it's grown very difficult to even analyze it or even say that it's going on. And that, I think, is the sort of the creeping racialization of American life that you talk about.
Yeah, we're definitely all feeling that. I was raised to be colorblind. I was raised to not see gender or race, and I did that, and it felt good to me, and it was fine. And now, as an adult, I'm being told that I have to see color, I have to see gender, I have to see race, and that people are creating a good pile, and I am clearly on the bad pile, and that, I think, is a source of the unease that many quote unquote white people feel in America. It's not about the racial issues. It's about the rights. It's about this new constitution. It's about this entirely new power structure that has been created for other people that is supra legislative. It is through executive power and the judiciary, well, more so the bureaucracy than anything. And that, I think, is what feeds into this sense of discontentment. And then if you raise this question, of course, you're branded as a white supremacist or a Nazi, because that is part of the tools that have been developed to fight this battle and political correctness and those sorts of things.